Good. So please welcome with me Serge Droz from ICT4Peace with his talk about rules and norms in the state conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for inviting me. Thank you for attending my talk. When I talk to engineers, to security professionals, I often hear, well, we technologists, we're engineers, we're not politicians, we don't do this policy stuff. Our stuff is kind of neutral, but really is it? We already had 3 talks, I think, in this conference that touched on policy. We started off this morning with a discussion about Apple's plans to fight child sexual abuse material. That's not a technical thing. The technical part is just a small thing. It was about, is this right or is it wrong? We had that talk by Kavya about virtual reality, the dangers of virtual reality. If you attended the talk, it was not about technology. It was not about kind of the AI has a technical vulnerability. It's about what does it do to humans? Or we just had Philip telling us how law enforcement works. So there's a lot of discussions going on that are largely ignored by technologists on how cyberspace should look like. And I'd like to take you on a journey and explain you a little bit of what is going on and why is it important to you. But as Christian said, ICT4Peace is a little-known organization, and somehow the slide doesn't change. Oh, maybe I need this one. Here it goes. So ICT4Peace is an international organization. It's actually a Swiss, Geneva-based foundation that was started nearly over 10 years ago to actually support the United Nations in adopting ICT. Because at the time, the United Nations, still a bureaucratic monster, was even more a bureaucratic monster, a lot of paperwork, and it was felt that, hey, this ICT stuff, this is the future, it's going to be promising. That is something you should be investing into. And today, the mission has kind of changed. Like the UN has realized, hey, there is this thing, it's ICT, and we have computers, and they do all of this. And the mission has really become 2 things. First of all, kind of promoting the peaceful use or the use of ICT for peace building on one hand, and on the other hand, actually make sure that ICT is not misused for malicious operations. Now, that is where we come from, and there's a lot of activities we do. We have experts talking about social media. We have experts talking about artificial intelligence. What I'd like today is talk about norms, and I'll explain you what norms are. Why is it important? Earlier this year, Google actually got into the headlines because it disrupted a nation-state operation by patching a couple of 0 days in Google Chrome. Turns out that nation-state was not one of the usual culprits. It was actually the US. And that brought up a lot of discussion about the role and the responsibilities of tech companies such as Google. And those are interesting discussions. And Google got a lot of flack. Personally, I think it was actually good that they do this. You should just not weaponize commodity IT. But the discussion is ongoing. Now, how did this come about? In quite a while ago, like 25 years ago, John Perry Barlow, who some of you may remember if you're old enough as the songwriter for the Grateful Dead or the founder of the electronic EFF, kind of published at the BEF in Davos the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace. At that time, he said, you are not welcome to us. Private industry and states were not welcome in cyberspace. What's been left of that? There was this idea of cyberspace is the new frontier. It's free. It's where we can do the stuff right. Well, turns out it's actually never really was. So just a really short history of nation-state attacks. 2003 is the earliest one that I remember, Titan Rain, a Chinese-based cyber operation attacking US defense contractors, stealing a lot of classified materials from the US authorities. which is kind of like, yeah, sure, it's the Chinese attacking the US military. You kind of would expect that to happen. And serves the military right if they connect their computers to the internet not knowing what they do. But then 2009, and I think this was really the point where I feel made this an important thing for me, is when Operation GhostNet was discovered. What was Operation GhostNet? Citizen Lab, Canadian-based security think tank at the University of Toronto, discovered that the Chinese were attacking the Dalai Lama and his people in their Indian exile. And they discovered that all their computers were hacked. That's what was kind of when Windows XP was big. The exploit was the Aurora exploit. And they published, among other things, the IOCs. And one of the companies to find these IOCs was actually Google. Google found that the Chinese have actually tried to attack its infrastructure, not because they wanted to have a search algorithm, but because they wanted to read the email of dissidents. This, incidentally, is the year Google pulled out of China, so who knows, maybe this is connected. But I think this is a game changer. It's a very, very important paper. It's a very, very important operation, because it really showed what is happening in the internet. Then 2010, just a year later, we had Stuxnet. Stuxnet attacked the Iranian uranium enrichment plant and in Natanz. It's actually, I went there. That was kind of an amazing trip. And it was celebrated as quite a success. I mean, they really did a lot of damage to the program that the Iranians had. But it also made the Iranians aware of the fact that, hey, the cyber stuff actually has something to it. And today, Iran is actually one of the top malicious players in cyberspace. Today, I kind of stopped counting. There's so much stuff going on that states are doing. Now, what is it that states are doing? What do you think? What are states mostly doing in cyberspace? Anyone? Absolutely, espionage. There's the Center for Foreign Relations, which is a US think tank, kind of collects information about publicly available nation-state sponsored operations and kind of categorizes this. And what you see really is it's mostly espionage. So that's what states do, that's what states like to do. And it's not really too surprising that they do this, because espionage is legal. It's not forbidden under international law. Even Switzerland, in its law governing the Secret Service, has a paragraph that says the Swiss Secret Service is allowed to compromise foreign computers if given certain conditions. So it is something really normal that's going on. And if you talk to states and say, hey, you really think this is a smart thing? Shouldn't we make this illegal? They all say, no, this shouldn't be illegal, because they all kind of feel we profit more than we actually risk. But that begs the question of what should states do in the internet? And that's a really big question. And that's a question that's been discussed for quite a while on the highest level. There's a group called the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, the UNGGE, who started in 2004, 1 year after Titan Rain. And so this is a group of 25 countries who can send delegates. Switzerland managed to be in that group, I think, every single time. And they meet for 2 years and discuss what's called norms for responsible behavior, state behavior in cyberspace. And I'm going to explain you what this means. So far, there have been 6 groups. The last one actually concluded this year. And it took about 3 groups to figure out, for states to agree, hey, international law halts in cyberspace. That was a big discussion. Think of this. States, the members of the United Nations, taking 6 years to figure out that international law should halt in cyberspace. Sounds kind of bizarre, but that's how international diplomacy works. Every one of these groups tries to produce what's called a consensus report, a report where all the members agree, that then goes to the General Assembly, who votes on it and says, yes, we support this. And that's why it's really so hard, because remember, in the UN, everyone has just one voice. So the highlight really was that 2013, they said, hey, yes, international law actually holds in cyberspace. And 2015, that was probably the most productive one. They came up with 11 norms or rules of how states should behave. Now, what are norms? I keep on using this thing. If you go to the UK, that's how people wait for the bus. They just queue up. Obviously, you can just walk in front of all of these people and enter the bus. It's not illegal, but you're not going to have a good time. That's what norms are. They're voluntary rules that you follow, and you follow kind of because everyone else follows them. And so what states really today are discussing are norms, voluntary kind of rules that they say, okay, we kind of stick to it, we feel it's really good. Now, a lot of people argue, well, but that's kind of useless because really, I mean, if it's just, you can stick to it, but you don't really have to. I mean, if a state feels they need to be a bad state, then they can just do it. Well, that's a little bit too easy. First of all, it makes the price higher for a malicious cyber operation. And second of all, in international law, there's a peculiarity, and that's that if states stick to norms long enough, they become law. Most of international law is not codified. Most of international law is just states have always been doing this, so you can't really stop doing this. And the hope is that these norms in cyberspace eventually become kind of uncodified law. Now, this kind of sounds a bit strange, but the next question really is who is actually doing, who is creating these norms? I mentioned UNGG, that's just one group. 2 years ago, the Russians started another group called the Openended Working Group, OEWG, which included all nations who wanted to participate. So at the end, I think it was about 125 nations. Russia argued, well, the UNGG is kind of a big boys club or something like this, so we don't want this, because Russia has a very different agenda, and they hope to kind of, by getting all the others in and pressuring them enough, they could change this thing. Then there's the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, who has norms, or they don't call them norms, they call them confidence-building measures. The idea being if we all stick to certain behaviors, this will ingest trust and will make it easier for states not to attack each other. There's technical ones, the Tech Accord, Paris Call, which is coming from France, it really was written by Microsoft. The African Union has ones. There's tons of bodies that apply to this, that create norms and say, hey, this is how states should behave, and that's how we should be doing, and so on. Now, you can say, hey, come on, Jude, what are you talking about? We are all kind of, most of us are working for private company, why do we care? Well, actually, some of these norms do have applications to us and affect us. So the UNGG, I mentioned, agreed international law holds in cyberspace, and that has consequences. Facebook, for example, is the first ever private company that has the dubious honor to be named guilty aiding to a genocide. And typically, that doesn't happen to private companies. States that commit genocides, but not private companies. So obviously, something went terribly wrong at Facebook. Then the GG 2015 had these 11 norms, and some of these norms are actually quite explicit. So, for example, Norm I says states should take reasonable steps to ensure the integrity of the supply chain, so end users can have confidence in the security of ICT products. States should seek to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT tools and technique to use the harmful hidden functions. So what this actually says is, do not build backdoors, and make sure you disclose vulnerabilities properly. Now, who discloses vulnerabilities? That's private companies, it's us. So I think this is a very, very strong statement. But actually getting from this fairly abstract norm to what does it really mean is quite a lot of work. Another one, kind of my favorite, was my first hat on this, that states feel you should not attack incident response teams. They're kind of like the firefighters of the internet, and you don't shoot firefighters. Again, this is really, really important, and it has implications for example, how we build CSIRTs. if you don't want people to start shooting at the sea certs, you have to make sure that your security teams, your sea certs, are not shooting. They should not be part of an offensive operation. A lot of states are not really sure about this, and there's a lot of national sea certs that are really kind of part of offensive organizations. I guess first and foremost the UK, who's put their national sea cert into the Secret Service. Not a very smart move. Now, there's a couple of organizations that try to look at what do these norms actually mean for us, because what a lot of diplomats don't realize is that, and it's kind of a party spoiler for diplomats and states, they don't own the internet, they don't operate the internet, they don't run the internet. That's something they're not used to. International relation used to be a government thing, and now all of a sudden, the biggest infrastructure on the planet, crossing all the borders, is operated by private industry. All the content comes from private citizens, or most of the content. That's very, very strange. So there's a couple of organizations that actually look on how we can make sure that these norms have an effect on us, on technologies, on the people that run the internet, and vice versa. So there's a Swiss-driven initiative called the Geneva Dialogue, who really goes through all of these international norms and discussions and says, hey, what's the role of industry here? Should they kind of apply this? UNIDIR, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, does a lot of stuff, mostly in terms of, like the last one they had was on vulnerability disclosure. These are things that are really, really important. And vulnerability disclosure, again, you may say, well, that sounds kind of easy, but look what Google did. Google closed a couple of 0 days, made that public, disrupting a US operation. So it has a political effect. Now, for this all to make sense, it's kind of obvious that the conversation has to go two ways. And the question is, does it really do this? Here is a picture of the Openended working group hearing that happened last January in New York. ICT4Peace could send someone there. And that was kind of great, because ICT4Peace is kind of a non-governmental organization. We're kind of more of a think tank, and we interact with civil society. But ICT4Peace has been talking to these people for a long time. It's in UN speak. ECOWAX accredited. That's an accreditation that the UN gives out to non-government organizations. It takes a couple of years to get that accreditation. And a lot of other organizations, for example, FIRST, were only allowed in here partly. A lot of smaller organizations are never heard. Civil society, think of civil society as journalists, as kind of grassroots NGOs that do a lot of the dirty work on this planet. They're never at these tables, yet they're affected by these discussions. Even though these discussions are really very kind of diplomat-driven, they sound very abstract. At the end of the day, it's about how we run the internet. They're not at the table, and that really is a bit of a problem. What can you do about it? I don't really know. Make sure you talk to people to get involved in these initiatives I mentioned on the slide before. But all in all, I think we've made some progress. States start to understand that they need to talk to other people. It's called the multi-stakeholder approach, even though it's not as multi as we oftentimes would like to wish. And some of the states clearly just throw this away. I was at a UNIDIR meeting where the Russian ambassador said, well, it should be the big states that get together and decide how to run the show, and that's it. Clearly, that's not what we want, because clearly we don't want the states to tell us how we have to run the internet. On the other side, also, we probably don't want companies like Facebook or Google to tell us how to run the world. So it is a difficult thing. What are a couple of challenges? So I think looking at 2021, when the UNGGE finished and the Open-Ended Working Group both finished with the consensus reports, people were a bit disappointed. I mean, yes, they were a lot longer than the previous ones, but it felt a little bit like turning in circles. No substantial progress has been made, especially The Openended working group had a kind of a report, and then it had a chairman's addendum where all the stuff that was important but kind of didn't find a consensus was in there. So a couple of things that delegates couldn't agree on is, for example, the role of sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean in cyberspace? What does it mean Switzerland is a sovereign state in cyberspace? I mean, obviously we don't have kind of border routers at the borders where the fiber crosses somewhere else. But what does it mean? No one really knows. The UK, for example, says the concept doesn't exist. There's no sovereignty in cyberspace, which is kind of strange from a country that regularly accuses Russia of violating their sovereignty. But hey. Then the other big discussion point is international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law is the law of the wars. It's not about who started the war, it's about how do you behave in an armed conflict. Is this valid in cyberspace? And so we don't really know what an armed attack is in cyberspace. There's international lawyers discussing this. Typically, the take is, well, if you just shut something down, you can turn it on, so it can't possibly be an armed attack, because after a real armed attack, you can turn things on. But those are side discussions. Some nations say, well, international humanitarian law should not hold in cyberspace because it kind of creates the notion of war in cyberspace, and that's what we want to avoid. Whereas other states say, well, actually, because cyber war is really going to happen. In a conflict, cyber is always a component, and we want to make sure that you cannot violate IHL in these things. IHL is the law that says an attack has to be proportioned. You can't just blow up an entire city just because one place is full of soldiers. There's a back and forth, but we couldn't agree on this, so we don't have any norms on it, which is kind of a pity. So that is one of the challenges that I see with this, so that we kind of stuck, and it seems sadly that the current political climate is not going to change this, and not sure what that means. All of this is kind of meaningless if you actually don't know who committed a crime, who violated the norm. And even though you cannot bring people to jail for violating a norm, you can at least finger point and make their lives miserable. So we have to figure out who did what. That's attribution, and that was the original plan, that we talk a little bit about attribution here. But attribution is kind of a difficult beast. 2 or 3 years ago, everybody would agree that attribution is really hard. It's very, very difficult. You saw these cartoons with the dog in the internet that said that didn't know, no one here in the internet knows that you're a dog. But that has kind of changed. If you look especially what the Americans do, they're pretty good in attributing. It takes them very little time in attributing. They've become really, really good. Other states are not as good. Then you have organizations like Citizen Lab. Citizen Lab regularly attributes, says NSO Group, Pegasus, all the other papers they do, and these are just a bunch of people. It's not a huge state. So attribution is something that can be done. So why is it still hard? Well, it's hard because it's not quite clear why people attribute. So why does the US attribute? Is it for a political gain? It sometimes is, to demonstrate to others, hey, we actually know what you do. I would say the attribution done in the pipeline ransomware case was probably to signal to the Russians, hey, we actually know what you do. But sometimes it's also to avert a crisis. Many of you may have wondered, why does the US indict Chinese military officials? There's no chance these people ever are going to show up in a US court. Well, one of the reasons, or one of the explanations is this is about de-escalation. Remember international humanitarian law, the law of the wars. It's not clear if it's valid or not, but if you take the law of the wars, it says you can actually shoot back in any manner if you're part of an armed attack. If someone violates kind of your sovereignty, integrity, starts shooting at you, you can shoot back with whatever means you want. Now, what does that mean in cyberspace? If someone attacks you and the country says, hey, we treat this as an armed attack, they can actually shoot back kinetically. This has happened twice. Israel has twice attacked Hamas and their cyber operations with kinetic weapons. But that's something people are very, very afraid of because there's a danger that this escalates. So what the US does by indicting people is actually says, this is criminal law. It's not international law. There's no chance you cannot punish criminals by shooting a cruise missile. Again, why you attribute? It's not always clear in which cases. Obviously, you have unequal resources. The US certainly has a lot of resources, and they're pretty good at attributing. The large tech companies, Microsoft, Google, and so on, they're pretty good at attributing, and they usually get it right. But what about smaller countries? And they're no less victims of cyber operations than the big countries, or civil society. Remember, these small NGOs, we have a group that brings together these small NGOs, and they talk about the attacks they see. And it's kind of amazing. They post something against their local leader, and suddenly they see all these events in their logs, but they can't attribute. They don't know who it is. It's a big crowd. Roles and responsibilities and lack of trust, these are all things that make attribution really, really hard. So, conclusions, sorry. Cyberspace is regulated, like it or not. If you feel you can do whatever you want to in cyberspace, you're on the wrong planet. That's time has gone. It's not really clear what the rules are, though, and they do affect us all. If you think, I'm not interested in the political stuff, that's something for someone else, well, look at what's happening to Apple, look at what's happening to Facebook. It will affect you. And last but not least, let's make sure cyberspace stays what it is, and that means we all have to work together. Thanks, Christian.
Thank you very much, Serge, for this very interesting overview. We're not yet over time, but we might be. But we have time for a question or two. Nadine, please.
Thank you, Serge, for this great talk. I just wanted to push back against some of the attribution claims, especially with regards to the reports published by Citizen Lab. A lot of the attribution made by Citizen Lab is actually based on very bad evidence. And they basically extrapolate from self-signed SSL certificates or IP addresses in order to blame nation states for certain malware dissemination. And it's actually quite rare that, or even completely non-existent, the times in which this actually leads back to a nation state in a way that can justify the amount of political and diplomatic turmoil that it ends up causing. So there has been a lot of questioning with regards to whether we can actually trust the methodology of state-level attribution that's adopted by Citizen Lab in these examples, and I don't think that people should walk off with an incorrect impression. That's all.
Thanks for mentioning this. I think this is a very, very important thing. So when it comes to attribution, I don't think we've come to agree on standards that tell us what is a good analysis, what does consist proof, and that is something we have to establish. And I think even Citizen Lab would agree that we haven't established these standards. It's a lot of discussion that needs to be done. So thanks a lot for that remark.
Good. So you can conclude your whole talk as we learn as we move on.
Absolutely.
And we have to.
We learn, and it's job security.
It's job security. Thank you very much, Serge. Here's a bit of chocolate for you. Wonderful. Thanks, Serge.